Hello, everyone, and welcome to the York Civil War Roundtable for tonight's February meeting.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the York Civil War Roundtable.
This is what happens when you're trying to do too many things.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the York Civil War Roundtable.
All right. I have to post some things on my phone on Facebook, so I apologize. That's why you heard me twice. Let's try this again. So here we are for the February 16th meeting. My name is Adam Bentz, and I am the Assistant Director of the Library and Archives. And we are happy to welcome back the Civil War Roundtable, which is under the direction of Kathy Friel, Program Director, and Scott Mingus Sr., who we'll be hearing from in just a few minutes, who is with us tonight, and Scott Rosenau, who I believe I saw in the chat. So I think everybody's here tonight, which is great. We're happy to have this partnership with the Roundtable, and we've been able to maintain a very healthy audience participation over the last year and a half or so that we've been on Zoom. So without further ado, if people can bear with me, I'd like to present some upcoming events at the History Center. You can say a lot of things about the York County History Center, but one thing you cannot say about us is that we don't have many events. So I'm actually surprised. I didn't realize we had quite this many things. So basically we have an average of 2 events per week for the next month or so. Tomorrow evening, that's February 17th at 7:00 p.m., we will be having a program, called York's Rosa Parks, Daisy Myers and the Quest for the American Dream. And if you're not familiar with this story, the YCHC published a second edition of a book called Sticks and Stones, which is an autobiography of Daisy Myers, which we have for sale at the History Center and on our page on Amazon. In any event, if you don't know anything about the story, please join us tomorrow night. We'll be welcoming Dr. Peter Levy from York College of Pennsylvania and Linda Myers, who is Daisy Myers' daughter, and they will be talking about her mother's experience in Levittown near Philadelphia, and also their life in York. So that's tomorrow evening. On Friday evening, that's February 18th at 7:00 p.m., we will be having our first of our Spirits of the Past series, Historic Mixology. And mixology, for the uninitiated, is bartending. But it's a flashier term. And in any event, this is something we've been getting pretty excited about. This will be an in-person event, and you can register, like all the events that are on here, you can look at on our website and register for them. But you will be able to learn how to make Fish House Punch, which is a colonial era beverage, and you'll be able to sample one before the end of the evening. Okay, so on February 19th, if you survive the Fish House Punch, just a joke, we will be celebrating our History Center Family Day, which was delayed a little bit. Usually we have these in January, but we decided to wait until February this year. And starting at 10:00 in the morning, and I think running into the mid-afternoon, we will be having our Family Day at the Agricultural and Industrial Museum. This is an in-person event, and again, we are asking for pre-registration for it. I should have said Spirits of the Past, which I just mentioned. That's taking place at our main Historical Society Museum on East Market Street. But Family Day will be at AIM. Okay, on February 23rd, that is a week from this evening, at 7:00 p.m., we will be welcoming the All Vets organization, and they will be featuring Mark Askey, who is a veteran of the Iraq conflict, who will be talking about his experience. This is an in-person event, and you can also attend on Zoom. On February 28th, this is another brand new event that we're trying out, 7:00 p.m., our bookmarked Zoom book club will be meeting, and this is all virtual on Zoom. Please feel free to register for it, and we will be discussing a book by Scott Mingus called The Ground Swallowed Them Up, which is an excellent book, and I think he may be referring to it tonight. We're very happy to have this at the History Center, and we appreciate our partnership with him. So they will be discussing your book on the 28th, Scott. On March 3rd at 7:00 p.m., we'll be having Writers Roundtable, and Brian Wade will be discussing his Keystone Oral Histories program, which he has put together for schools primarily, to discuss the achievements, the legacy of many veterans of color. And he will be at the Writers Roundtable in person at the Historical Society Museum, but this will also be a Zoom event. That's on March 3rd at 7 p.m. And then finally, on March 6th at 2:30 in the afternoon, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be meeting for their monthly meeting, and they will be featuring Brad Emig, who is a gunsmith and an expert on colonial era and early American gunsmithing. He'll be discussing gunsmithing in Eastern Pennsylvania at their meeting. So a wide variety of programming here, suited for many different tastes. Please join us for one of these events or all of them. So many of you may be wondering, so here we are. What are we going to be doing in the roundtable next month? So on March 16th, for many of you, you may know that March is Women's History Month, and we were fortunate to be able to get Mr. Ronald S. Coddington to speak and to give a talk that he's developed called Faces of Civil War Nurses. During the American Civil War, women radiated patriotic fervor equal to their male counterparts. They contributed to the war effort in many ways, forming charitable societies, becoming nurses, or even marching off to war as vivandiers, or unofficial attachés to regiments. Ronald Coddington talks about the experiences of women of all ages and walks of life who provided care during the war. Their personal narratives are as unique as fingerprints. Each provides a distinct entry point into the larger social history of the brutal and bloody conflict. Using original, identified, wartime photographs of women on both sides of the conflict, many of them never before published, Coddington uncovers the personal histories of each intrepid individual. This is his fifth and final book in a series of micro-histories of the Civil War generation: Union soldiers, Confederate soldiers, African-American participants, sailors, and women. All are published by the Johns Hopkins University Press. His writings have also appeared in the New York Times Disunion series, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications. He is currently the editor of Military Images, a quarterly magazine that showcases, interprets, and preserves Civil War photography. And he's a graduate of the University of Georgia. So please join us in 4 weeks' time for Mr. Coddington and Faces of Civil War Nurses. So without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce two men. If you've ever heard of York County history, most likely you've run across Mr. Jim McClure and Scott Mingus. They're both prolific. They've given a number of talks for the Civil War Roundtable in the last few years that I've been involved with the History Center. And so if you're not familiar with them, I'd like to introduce them tonight. So Jim McClure is the retired editor of the York Daily Record and the York Sunday News, and USA Today's Network's state editor for Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. He holds a master's degree in American Studies from Penn State Harrisburg, where he focused on York County journalism history. He's the author or co-author of 9 books on York County history and moderates the 15,000-member Retro York Facebook group. He is past president of Pennsylvania Associated Press Managing Editors and past president of the Pennsylvania Society of Newspaper Editors. He led York Daily Record and Sunday News' history teams that won 2 G. Richard Dew Awards for journalistic service, Pennsylvania's most prestigious honor for outstanding journalism. Scott Mingus is a retired scientist and product development executive in the global pulp and paper industry. The Ohio native was part of the research team that developed the first commercially successful self-adhesive U.S. postage stamps, and he was a pioneer in barcode labels. He has written 27 Civil War and Underground Railroad books. His biography of General William Extra Billy Smith won multiple awards, including the Dr. James I. Robertson Jr. Literary Prize for Confederate History. He has also written numerous articles for Gettysburg Magazine and other historical journals. Scott has appeared on C-SPAN, C-SPAN 3, PCN, and other TV networks. Mingus and his wife Debbie live in York County, Pennsylvania. He writes a blog on the Civil War history of York County, yorkblog.com/Cannonball. One more comment before we get started tonight, and I can see just from even before we began tonight, the chat was very lively, which is a good sign. Both Jim and Scott have asked that you can feel free to share your questions and comments throughout the presentation tonight. It's kind of different than what we usually do, but please feel free to share them. And we will be pausing from time to time in order to discuss your thoughts. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our speakers.
Okay. Are the slides up on the screen, Adam?
They look great.
Sounds good. Jim and I wanted to talk today about some of the lost sites of York County and the Underground Railroad and Civil War. This is going to be a pretty freewheeling and actually fairly almost successive series of short anecdotes. We're not going to go into a lot of depth on any one subject. We want to whet your appetite. It just is what's out there. York County is actually quite historic all the way through from pre-colonial days until modern times. But there's a lot of things in the Civil War and Underground Railroad places that people may not be aware of. And one thing we want to focus on the fact that it's not just enough to read about things or to watch a video about things or to attend a York Civil War Roundtable meeting. You really need to get out and tramp the ground. One of the things that over the years in writing as many Civil War books as I've written, and of course Jim is the same way with the books he's written, is you really can't do justice to any topic until you get out and see the ground. A dear friend of mine, Ed Bars, recently deceased a couple years ago. Ed always said there was no substitute for walking the ground. He's absolutely right. So it's about exploring the actual ground. Where do these places happen? And maybe you can learn something about their culture, about their lifestyle, about what happened just by walking through it. Here in York County, we've got almost 900 square miles. So there's plenty of opportunity, and there are places of history in almost every corner of the county. So today is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of imagination, but it's a fairly quick look at, say, 20 or 25 different places we thought people might be interested in. So I will turn it over to Jim, and Jim, you can take it away and go on the next slide.
Yeah, are you going to go over the those sites that you tramped over?
Sure, I can do that.
Yeah.
Some of these places Jim and I have both tramped to, but we just kind of divided up. We're just going to talk about it. So tonight we're going to look at the Samuel and Marion Berry House down in Shrewsbury Township. We're going to then journey north to Newberry Township and look at another Underground Railroad house where I spent a lot of time ferreting out where it was. And then talk about the Prigg versus Pennsylvania legal case that happened in southeastern York County in Lower Chancery Township. And then a recent tramp that I did with my friend Andy Blessing, where we went to the site of one of the Civil War's more infamous murders here in York County that happened near Emmets Grove Campground. Also want to chat about Pennville down in southwestern York County, just outside of Hanover. Then we're going to jump back into Newberry Township and talk about an infamous murder that happened in the early days of the Underground Railroad here in York. And then we're going to zip over to Wrightsdale and talk about a marker there, it's a Confederate marker, and then we're going to talk about a couple other Confederate markers that are here in York. We don't have monuments honoring Confederates in York County, but we do have some markers that recall the history of the Civil War and the Gettysburg Campaign here in York County. With that, Jim, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and thanks to the Scotts, Adam and Kathy Friel for holding this wonderful evening here. Yeah, we're going to talk first about Horse Thief Lane near Hanover, and I don't know if Richard Resch is here, but he's the one who did the tramping on that, so we might give him a cameo appearance if he's here. We'll talk about the Surrender House at Farmers out in western York County, and we'll tramp as far as the Center Square, Continental Square, the flagpole that used to be there, the Center Square of York. We'll talk about P.A. Small's house in York, now known as Center for Community Engagement. We'll talk about the Lebanon Cemetery, with some neat things going on there. The memorial for the Black fighting man at Wrightsdale. We'll talk about that. And then the burned bridge in Columbia. We'll go across the river for a second and talk about a site over there.
So again, I want to thank you, Jim, for and Adam as well. Let's get started and chat about this. This is the Samuel and Marion Berry house. For those of you who may not be familiar with them, Samuel Berry was an enslaved in Maryland, and he worked a night job in Baltimore, manufacturing brooms in a broom factory. And his owner allowed him to keep a portion of the money that he earned from his second job. Over time, he saved enough money to buy his own freedom. He moved to Shrewsbury Township after becoming a free man, and eventually he had enough money to go back to the South, bring his wife and his children up into York County. He became actively involved in the Underground Railroad in Shrewsbury Township with some of the white abolitionists such as John Lowe and Isaac Hendricks and some of the other devout abolitionists in that area. But the site of where Berry's house was has been lost to history for a long time. Trying to figure out exactly where this house was became one of the things I was really interested in when I wrote my book, Guiding Lights, Underground Railroad Conductors here in York County, as well as the earlier groundswell of them up that Adam mentioned. And after reading through Amanda Smith Berry Smith's autobiography, as well as doing some detective work in combination with Donna Peace of Summit Grove Campgrounds, Donna and I jointly located where we think the most likely scenario is for the Berry's house. The problem is it's under I-83. So you're not going to be able to go see even the site where this was. We think it's smack underneath 83 or really close to it. But if you look on this 1860 map of York County that I show in the middle, you'll see the yellow is the Hendricks house. That is the Blue Ball Tavern, still sits there along the Susquehanna Trail. Lowe's Campgrounds is the Oak Woods neighborhood south of Shrewsbury. And we know from Amanda Berry Smith's memoirs that her house was near that campgrounds. And if you look carefully on this 1863 map, that's not a smudge, that's a small house. So I think that's the most likely scenarios where Berry's lived. It also fits the fact that Amanda said they pretty much lived near the Isaac Hendricks house, which was to the east, and of course the tavern, which was the west. Again, the site is lost to history. On the left of the picture where the pond shows Oakwoods Drive, that is the original drive that went to the campgrounds. That would be right at that red circle where it intersects the Susquehanna Trail and it leads off into the woods. The photograph on the right is coming the other direction from where is marked J. Fife House, if you will, just above the picture. That is Campground Roads. And that goes back into the towards 83 and actually dead ends right at Route 83. So we think we pretty well have pinpointed the Berry house. I talk about the search for that in our book, Guiding Lights. Jim, I'm going to continue on briefly. We're talking about another Underground Railroad site that I found, again, this was prompted by you and also by some other folks who were involved in the York Daily Record when we were commemorating the Harriet Tubman 2 or 3 years ago. And we know that from writings of Isaac Betts and a few other people, Israel Betts, and a few other people back in the 19th century, that Ezekiel Baptiste entertained Harriet Tubman on at least one occasion, possibly twice, at his house. Well, where was his house? And again, just some basic detective work, we were able to find that. The Baptiste house is shown again on the 1860 map, correlating that to modern maps and then using the land records of the York County Archives to verify that indeed that piece of property was owned by Ezekiel Baptiste. Now, what was interesting about this piece of property is Baptiste was very rare. It was a black man and his wife and their children who owned the property. Very often, black men such as Samuel Berry were tenant farmers living on someone else's property. not Baptist. He owned the property outright, paid cash for it, in fact. So where was the Baptist house? It still exists today. You can see the photograph from the bottom. I took that from the roadway. The house has been heavily modified. The barn's been replaced over the years. So the property bears almost no resemblance whatsoever to what it would look like when Harriet Tubman first came there. Good news is the property's still intact. It's not a housing development and it still sits there. With that, I'll turn it back to Jim and we can talk about southwestern York County and talk about Horse Thief Lane.
Yes, a couple of years ago, Harold Coldren from the West Manheim History Committee asked me to come down and speak. And I'd been through West Manheim before, but never really had intentionally studied it. So I started tramping down there and then reading about it. And this is it's on the map there at about 7 o'clock, right in the tip of York County. Southwestern tip of York County. So I even went through the town of Hobart, and if you look up who Hobart was, he was vice president under McKinley, died in office. If he hadn't died in office and continued on, he might have been president because Theodore Roosevelt replaced him as vice president. So anyway, that's just a metaphor for West Manheim. There's so many surprising and wonderful things to look at down there, and that history committee is doing really great work down there, writing books and so forth, including Horse Thief Lane by Richard Resch. And he picked up on some of the work that his grandfather had done, Clark Wentz, and set out to try to find Horse Thief Lane. And he ended up finding, he used LIDAR, he used engineering tools, and he ended up finding Horse Thief Lane. And this was really named after, when the Confederates came through York County in 1863, 11,200 of them all together. They had a penchant for stealing horses. And so the local populace would hide the horses. And that's so Rich went back and tried to find the hollow or the place where maybe they would have hidden the horses. And he went back, he found this road through his various research approaches, this little lane. It's really a driveway, and kept walking back, and he found a ravine that he thinks maybe was the location. It's overgrown, it's deep, but when you think about it, they probably would have been near water, brought their livestock near water. It's located, this little lane is located as private property, but it's located about a mile past Walmart to the west of the Baltimore Pike as you go down through West Manheim. It's right near Shorbs Hill Road. If you're looking to tramp, I don't know, I think you probably would need permission to go back there, as you will often when you deal, almost all the time, when you deal with private property around York County. So some mysteries can be solved, some mysteries can be, and Rich Resch did solve this one and did the legwork, so we all can benefit from it. Is Rich Resch on the call?
I'm just looking through the attendees, and I have not seen him on here
Okay,
as yet.
maybe he'll join us later. So that's the story of Horse Thief Lane.
Okay, going back to the Underground Railroad for a minute, another site that I went and found was the site of the it essentially became the very first Supreme Court case involving York County. Very quickly and short order, involved a lady by the name of Margaret Morgan. She was born enslaved in Maryland to elderly parents on the Ashmore estate near Mill Green. That's north of Darlington in Harford County. Well, Mr. Ashmore didn't mind that Mrs. Morgan had gotten married. She moved off the plantation. Mrs. Morgan believed she had actually been freed, in fact, although no paperwork was ever formally submitted by Mr. Ashmore. So she ends up married and living in Pennsylvania, having children. Well, Mr. Ashmore dies, and his son-in-law and his widow are interested in raising capital. They've got a mill to run. They've got a number of other business interests that need cash flow, and they decide to send a professional slave catcher as well as an attorney, as prescribed by the law, and 2 other men up into Pennsylvania to go get Mrs. Morgan and her 6 children. But to find out where they are, they don't know. Well, almost by happenstance, they've heard that they're somewhere in southeastern York County. So the son-in-law, Nathan Bemis, is out scouring southeastern York County. He happens to come across the Matthew Wallace house. Wallace has a number of black men and some white men who are either tenants or hired help who are threshing in this wheat fields. And Nathaniel Bemis overhears somebody use the term Jerry Morgan. So he understands now that he's finally found his prey. He finds out from locals exactly where Morgan lives, goes back into Maryland, brings his 3 cohorts back with him, and they kidnap Mrs. Morgan and the 6 children. That's kidnapping by Pennsylvania law. By Maryland law, they're just fulfilling their duty to capture a runaway slave, a fugitive person who's been enslaved, who still by the laws of Maryland was legally enslaved. We don't still to this day know exactly where this situation occurred. Where was Morgan's house? One possibility is the Wallace farm itself. Wallace had 2 houses, one of which he lived in, which was close to today's Kyleville, which then was known as Centerville. Lower Chancery Post Office in the upper left is today's Airville, to give you an idea of where we're talking about in Lower Chancery Township. Now, the upper house might have been where Morgan's lived. That is what I suspect. I can't prove that. I don't know that. None of the property records that I've searched in the York County Archives suggest the names of Wallace's tenants, other than to say he did indeed have tenants living on his property. So for the sake of an argument, if we assume that the upper Wallace house is where the kidnapping occurred of Mrs. Morgan and her children, the view on the bottom left is today's site. This is heavily overgrown, very wooded, very out of the way location, off the main drag, in fact. But again, gives you an idea of how remote this area would have been, even in 1830s. So I think we've located at least the general vicinity of where this occurred. A search through York County History Center's records over the years, a number of people, including some of Adam's predecessors, have looked hard for this location. This is probably as close as we're going to get, barring some unforeseen legality, a legal document that may exist. So I think I've scoured just about all of them. With that, let's turn it back to Jim and let's talk about a place that is there where we know exactly what happened.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that the 2 places you've shown so far, or 2 of the places, one has a power line going across, another one has a superhighway going atop it. These sites aren't going to last forever, as we know. This is the surrender house where the surrender of York took place. It's out. It's near Farmers. That you go out as you're heading west on Lincoln. As you come to Farmers, you see Sunbelt Rentals. You take a left. You go back Locust Lane, and it's off to your right. I don't know, maybe a quarter mile out there. You might want to bring a picture with you because it is a little hard to spot. I haven't been out there for the last year. I'm presuming it's still there, but it's this is where John B. Gordon accepted the keys to the town on the 27th of June, 1863, the Jacob Altland farmhouse. And Gordon talks in his autobiography or his memoirs, his reminiscences about a farmhouse that he stopped out, had a spring in the basement. And he didn't say where that farmhouse was, but then immediately goes into the occupation of York after that. So the implication is this place. So I wondered if there was a spring in the basement of this place. Here's what he writes. I'm just going to read this real quick. My camp for the night was nearby, and I accepted his invitation. That's Altland's invitation to breakfast with him. As I entered the quaint room, one half covered with smooth limestone, the other half covered with limpid water, bubbling clear and pure from the bosom of Mother's Earth, my amazement at the singular design was perhaps less pronounced than the sensation of rest which it produced. For many days, we had been marching on the dusty turnpikes under a broiling sun, and it's easier to imagine than to describe the feeling of relief and repose which came over me as we sat in that cool room with a hot breakfast served from one side, while from the other, the frugal housewife dipped cold milk and cream from immense jars standing neck deep in water. So I wondered, and so I went out to the house, and I think I had an appointment. This was many years ago. And I went in and asked if I could see the basement, and went down the basement with the homeowner, and there was a spring there, and it was about a yard square, and I didn't see it bubbling, but it was definitely an open spring in the basement, and it was cool down there. So she told me that at the time that it had been dry a couple times, but that it was obviously the day I was there, it was bubbling. So, this is obviously the house that Gordon was talking about. And I just think it's interesting that this house is off the beaten track. It's not marked, but a big moment happened there in the history of York County, the surrender of York to the Confederates. So maybe it should be marked in some way. But it is a wonderful place. On private property, you just have to be careful and get permission before you tramp around there.
Yeah, one thing that corroborates this is the house is there's the damage claims from York County that are on the website of the York County History Center corroborate the fact that several nearby farms that are adjacent to this farm were indeed Confederate campsites, because those farmers created claims for large numbers of men occupying their property, including a very large farm on the Jackson Square Road, as well as some others right off of, in fact, one of my long lost relatives, the Mingus farm off of Locust Lane. So this definitely was the site. Another place that I want to talk about. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
Why don't we just, I would say the homeowner also had some, had a box full of things that connected the house from past owners with the surrender. Maybe we, excuse me, maybe we could pause for a second and just ask if there are any questions at this point. We're plugging along here. Want to see if there's any questions that we've raised up to this point. I think just unmute yourself and speak up.
We do have a comment from Eric. He's wondering if you have any modern maps that kind of show where these sites are in today's geography and with roads.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've got some of those on my blog. I've got a lot of these places that I do have maps for. So certainly if you're interested in any of these areas, you can send me an email at scottmingus@yahoo.com, and I'll be happy to share the locations. Again, recognizing what Jim said earlier, that many of these are private properties, so you will need homeowners' permission to go on these properties. And in some cases, such as the one we're going to talk about right now, that's very difficult to get the homeowners permission unless you have people who know the homeowner quite well to begin with and have previous relationships with them. Adam, anything else that's come in?
So we just got a question from Tom Davidson. He said, Scott mentioned Oak Woods Road, which is now Oakwood Road here in New Freedom. Any idea when the street name changed?
That's a great question. I mean, when the first early street names were, it actually had an S on it in the early newspaper accounts. And I think it was probably because it was the Oak Woods that were John Lowe's campground. And I'm probably sometime, I'm sure in the early 20th century, the S was dropped and the words were combined into one. It was Oak Woods as two separate words, and then became Oakwood, which is the modern designation for it. So I don't have the exact time. I just know that if you look at the old newspaper records, that shift did occur over the course of the turn of the century.
Scott and I haven't talked about this directly, but in terms of the previous question, I know that we can publish on Witnessing York or on Cannonball blog the list of sites we're talking about with directions as to how to get there. And we'll do that within the next couple of weeks.
Great idea. Yeah, here's an interesting site. This is Emmons Grove Campground. Again, this property is one that the owner does not want people tramping on, but it's a piece of ground that back in the 1880s was quite well known in York County. This was one of the largest religious campgrounds, was a Brethren campground. But back during the Civil War, long before it was a campground, this was the site of the murder of a Union soldier, presumably from the 76th Pennsylvania, although there's even some debate as to which unit the soldier was from. But his body was found by Greenbrier Spring that was just to the southeast of the campgrounds as they were developed later in the 1880s. The dead body had on a Union uniform, had a deep contusion on the back of his head. Apparently somebody had clubbed him, probably with a rifle butt, perhaps a Confederate soldier did the killing, but nobody really knew who this guy was. He was buried originally by the spring, but for many years, the Methodist or the Brethren campground children on Children's Day would follow Colonel James Staley and other Civil War veterans to the gravesite. They would have a ceremony there. They would decorate the gravesite with flowers, and they would have readings and poems, and they would all sing patriotic songs. And it was kind of a highlight of the year. And a lot of the Grand Army, the Republic, and later the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War continue this commemoration. In fact, it was so popular, they ended up digging the bones up, moving the bones closer to the campgrounds and closer to the Northern Central Railway stop, to the point where the railroad actually, for about a 10-year period, actually had a dedicated stop during the 2 weeks in August in which the camp was in session. And then it was a flag stop the rest of the year for people who wanted to visit the campgrounds. We going back, tramping, the picture in the upper right is one of the two wells that was dug at the campgrounds for the campers. The picture on the bottom left shows the foundation stones all jumbled up of one of the old camp buildings. So one time there were more than 75 cabins on this campground, and the entire thing was destroyed by a terrible fire that devastated the entire campgrounds, and they ended up not rebuilding. In fact, they moved the campgrounds down to Smith Station. But again, this is a lost site. What makes this interesting is the dead body, after the campgrounds closed, was moved to Prospect Hill Cemetery. And even to this day, it is the tomb of the unknown soldier, if you will, here in York County. And again, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War and other groups at times commemorate that fallen United States soldier who, again, his name's been lost to history. With that, I'll turn it back to Jim. Let's talk about downtown York.
Yeah, this center of Continental Square is just a fascinating thing. A lot has happened there. I'm going to pick two things. One is that, of course, the Articles of Confederation were adopted in a courthouse right in the middle of that square, the county courthouse in the middle of that square. It started, that whole Articles of Federation movement started in 1776 when Richard Henry Lee asked, for three things to happen. He was a Continental Congressman. He asked for Declaration of Independence, an Article of Confederation, or some type of constitution, and then treaties with foreign powers in the American Revolution. Needed that to wage war versus the British. So when Congress left on June 27, 1778, they had an adopted document in hand. It needed to be ratified by the state still, but they accomplished what Richard Henry Lee called for, Richard Henry Lee from Virginia. Well, 86 years later, Robert E. Lee's troops came to Center Square, and that was after the surrender we talked about involving John B. Gordon. They entered York County on York County soil on June 27th, 1863, 86 years after Richard Henry Lee or the delegates left to go back to Philadelphia. And so we have a Lee that started the Articles of Confederation. We have a Lee that ended the Confederation. And you think about it, the Articles of Confederation brought together, the country, the 13 states into a nation, into a country. And then to the townspeople and others, and when the Confederate soldiers came and took down that flag in the very place where that Colonial Courthouse stood, it symbolized the deconfederation. In other words, Robert E. Lee, Richard Henry Lee's first cousin, 2 times removed, as I understand it, undid what his cousin did. So it's kind of interesting, irony there. But going to the next slide, the flagpole wasn't done yet. The flagpole, you can see the market sheds were torn down in late June 1863. A lot happened, 1887, excuse me, a lot happened in late June, and they tore these market sheds down because they got in the way of the trawl. As you can see, the flagpole was still there. And so to celebrate the anniversary, or the fact that the borough had become a city in 1887. You can see at the bottom right, they had arches and so forth. That's PA&S Small Store there to the left of that photo. But you can see the flagpole, they used it for streamers to kind of celebrate this big moment that York became a city. And what is interesting about that, the flagpole came down not long afterwards, I think in the 1890s, because York had become a city and they wanted that center square completely vacant so they can move trolleys around there. We really have the American Revolution. This all started with the American Revolution, and now we're in the Industrial Revolution, and they needed that space in that center square, not to make laws, not to do anything else, but to have that square open so goods and people can move through there as they as they went to work. So very interesting spot there, right in the center of the square.
Yeah, next place we want to briefly chat about, we go back to the Hanover area and take a look at Pennville. Pennville, also known as Butttown and a few other names over the years, no longer exists, but it's basically the intersection of the Westminster Pike with the Frederick Street on the southern side of York. Now, during the June 30th, 1863 Battle of Hanover, which to this day, thank God, remains the largest military engagement in York County history, with more than 300 casualties. This almost, Hanover came very close to becoming the place where the Union Army captured the famed Confederate Cavalier, Major General Jeb Stuart. Stuart and his aide, W.W. Blackford, were way out in front of the troops. They actually were stranded in a field near the Forney Farm, if you will, just outside of where Turkey Hill is today, to give you an idea on Forney Avenue. They were out in that particular area, ran into some West Virginia cavalrymen who chased them back towards the south. And to escape in the neighborhood today, that's heavily residential neighborhood, began open fields in 1863. Stuart and Blackford both had to jump their Virginia horses over what is described as a 15-foot wide and very deep drainage ditch. Reality, it's a small stream or rivulet, if you will, which is not nearly as wide or as deep today as it was then, but 160 some years later, it's still there. And it actually meanders through this residential neighborhood, through people's backyards. But again, you can access this and see this quite clearly directly from the Westminster Pike. So again, to Jim's point about having directions available, this is quite easy to find. And again, it's very easy to traverse, and you can be seen from multiple locations in and around the Hanover area. Now, Pennville also played a role in the Underground Railroad. Matt Jackson and a number of leading citizens of Hanover, as well as a couple licensed battlefield guides from Gettysburg who live in the Hanover area. And I was privileged enough to do some of the editing for the new series of signs that Hanover has put up. It's a marvelous series of more than a dozen or so, actually quite a bit more than a dozen signs that have went up in Hanover. This particular sign on the bottom, on the lower right, talks about the Pied Piper of Freedom. This is Bill Piper, who lived in a cottage at Pennville, one of the cottages that was there when the Confederates and Jeb Stuart came rolling through and fought the Battle of Hanover. So again, much like there's tremendous linkage, as we'll find out, between the Underground Railroad sites in York County and the Civil War. One really can't talk about one without talking about the other. So in this particular case, again, it's ironic that Confederate soldiers are fighting on the very ground that was an Underground Railroad. In fact, the Battle of Hanover begins at Pennville when some of the Confederate cavalry under John Chambliss's brigade intercept the Pennsylvania Cavalry Regiment right at this very intersection. Bill Piper was a well-known fiddler and entertainer, would go around to the different venues in York County and Northern Maryland and would entertain people with his fiddle. At the same time, he kept a fairly low profile in his own house. But at one point, somebody was able to peek in and discover a bunch of black men having breakfast with him, and that revealed the fact this was truly a stop on the Underground Railroad. Jim, I'm going to turn it back to you. Let's go back to York.
Yeah, and this is some of us still remember it as the Lafayette Club in downtown New York. It's now the Center for Community Engagement. It was a home starting in 1839 of P.A. Small, the P.A. Small family, and he was the leading merchant in town. And he and William C. Goodrich had a business relationship. But one thing that's really documented is the fact that Small satisfied judgments against some properties that Goodrich had when Goodrich fell into some financial issues. They were both Republicans, and they obviously knew each other. It's kind of, and then P.A. Small, that house then passed on and became the Lafayette Club in 1912. Interestingly, the Lafayette Club, was an exclusive club. Blacks couldn't join that club until 1998. So William C. Goodrich wouldn't be able to join that club, or his relatives until 1998. This is an interesting point about this club. Now it's become the Center for Community Engagement, which promotes inclusivity. One of the things that happened over the years was there was an auction there at this place at the Lafayette Club after the Lafayette Club opened up, and the auction was to benefit the William C. Goodrich Freedom Center. So it kind of came full circle there. A man who couldn't be in there was then his house, in order to help his house and the house museum that's there, the Freedom Center. They had an auction to try to raise money for it. And then the last part of that story is that since the Community Center for Community Engagement has had it, they've had at least two exhibits in there from Black artists, and one of them featured a painting by Affiliate Chambliss of John Aquila Wilson. And you can see him right in the center. Highly decorated. He was a United States color troop member of 32nd of the USCT, and he lived to be 101 years old. The last Civil War veteran to die in York County died in 1942. The young lady there is Nikela, and I'll probably mispronounce her name, but Nikela Wilson. And she was in there just touring and saw this picture and said, "That's my great-grandfather." It was her great-grandfather 3 times. So it shows how history can connect with young people. And, and we have a real hero there being celebrated even today in the, in the Center for Community Engagement.
Yeah, one of the other places that I did a fair amount of tramping at, but not nearly as much as I would like, is Lebanon Cemetery. There are a number of very dedicated volunteers that have been working to restore this cemetery. It's been a lot of the tombstones over the years have been fallen over, been lost under the soil and the foliage. Over the years, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, tremendous work has been done to restore the cemetery. Even now, the work's ongoing, and the Friends of Lebanon Cemetery, I'm sure, will welcome your support and your help. This again is privately owned facility, but I had permission to go tramp on it. You can see the entrance there off of South George Street or North George Street on the west side of the road. Again, this was a Black cemetery. At the time, the cemeteries were segregated. Prospect Hill was a white cemetery. This cemetery was for African Americans. Civil War connection, as well as some Underground Railroad connections here to the Goodrich and Gray families that were involved in the Underground Railroad. But a number of Civil War veterans, particularly men from the U.S. Colored Troops. And here I just put 2 of them. This is David Young of the 8th United States Colored Troops, Lewis King from the 25th. And they're just some of the scores of Black men from York County who either served as U.S. Colored Troop soldiers or men from other counties who retired or moved to York County after their military service concluded and died here in York and were buried at Lebanon Cemetery. So again, this is a cause that had been lost, somewhat lost, if you will, but certainly is being restored and is being tended to with a lot of interpretation to come in years to follow. Another place I want to talk about just briefly is to go back to the Underground Railroad again. This is a piece of ground in northern York County near the town of Lewisberry. This happens to be a house where a member of the Garrettson family lived. They were involved as conductors in the Underground Railroad. They also took advantage of a law in Pennsylvania in the 1830s and 40s that said if you lived in Pennsylvania for 6 months, you were free, no matter where you came from, where your owner was from, if you had gainful employment and were a resident for 6 months. So and a lot of the Quakers, as well as the free blacks of York County, deliberately would shelter escaped fugitives, freedom seekers from Maryland and point south, and they would give them employment. And Joseph Garrettson was certainly one of these people that was doing that. He had a person who had been enslaved near Reisterstown, Maryland, who had escaped and come to York County, a fellow by the name of George. We don't know a last name, if he even had a last name. But according to court documents, a number of boys from Quickle's Corner, which is near the intersection of Canal Road and Susquehanna Trail, near the Lutheran Church. Some of the Quickles, in fact, are buried at the cemetery across the street from that church. Well, these 4 members of the Fetro family were slave catchers or slave hunters. They ended up going to the Garrettson farm and trying to get access to the house. They finally managed to get the Quakers out of the way, and 3 of the men entered the house. George, who's upstairs in the attic, jumps out of the attic. So if you look on the building, look on the white roof on the right side of the house, the stone part of the house, up near what was the TV antenna back in the 60s, George is going to leap from basically right underneath that roof pitch to the ground below. That's some 22 feet that he jumps down. He severely injures, if not breaks, one of his legs. He crawls through a cornfield towards the barn, tries to escape, is shot in the back. They take him inside the barn. They remove 16 pieces of buckshot from his back, send him back to Reisterstown, where eventually George will die. And the 4 Fetro boys are tried in York County Court. They're actually, 3 of them were found guilty, but they're only given a minor fine, and it's basically a slap on the wrist, and are turned loose to go back into the community. This is the first known killing of a fugitive slave on York County soil. Again, a place that you need permission to go visit, and the place is heavily modified. Doesn't look anything like this today as to what it looked like back in the 1960s when this photograph was taken by the person who lived there at the time. Jim, I'm going to jump back to you and let's go east.
Yeah, I'm going to fly because we're going to run out of time here.
Okay.
It's a good thing, a wealth of riches here. Many people know the story that when Gordon was coming on the bridge at Wrightsville, the defended ground at Wrightsville, which Scott will talk about in a second. There's a squad of volunteers from Columbia, black men from Columbia came over to build entrenchments, and then put down their shovels and shouldered muskets. One of those who did that was killed. The only mortality in the Battle of Wrightsville, or the skirmish at Wrightsville. And for years, we still don't know his identity. And for years, he was uncelebrated. But meanwhile, upriver, and Scott's going to talk about this in a second, there's a Confederate grave, an unknown Confederate who died presumably on York County soil. And he was celebrated with a headstone and several different markers over the course of time. So that seemed weird that we'd have a Union defender, who was uncelebrated, and a Confederate who was celebrated. So a Black Masonic group in 2013, 150th of Gettysburg, corrected that. And you can see the tombstone in Mount Pisgah Cemetery to the left, celebrating or honoring this volunteer. It's at Mount Pisgah Cemetery, which is south of Wrightsville, just on the edge of Wrightsville. At the time, some people said, well, why wouldn't you put this in Wrightsville's main cemetery? Why would you put it kind of off the beaten track? But that's where it is. And Scott, maybe you could talk for a second there. I know there's some markers going up around Wrightsville, and that might be remedied in putting this brave deed into a more prominent area. So go ahead, Scott, for the next slide.
Yeah, the next site is, where was this guy killed? So almost all the vestiges of the Civil War trenches that surrounded Wrightsville are long gone. They were gone in the by 1900, in fact, other than just some scattered vestiges could still be seen as late as 1930. But the picture on the upper left shows an aerial view taken in 1930. Again, the entrenchments are long gone. I've tried to fill in roughly where they would have been between 8th and 9th Street near Fisherman's Lane. On the upper right shows the Columbia Company. That's the black men that are shouldering guns. There are 53 of them next to the 27th Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia who have uniforms. The Columbia Company are a vast array of civilian clothes, according to one of the 27th officers who was a newspaper editor. You can see a modern, here's one where we do have a modern map. So on the left, you can see this is Fisherman's Lane, which is a relatively new housing development in the last 2 or 3 decades. So again, all vestiges of where this man died are long gone. There's no way to really do that and just drive around and kind of imagine where it would have happened. Jim briefly mentioned the Confederates. We're going to talk about just very quickly 3 Confederate grave markers or commemorations here in York County. There are 5 Confederates buried at Prospect Hill Cemetery. We do not know where. A cenotaph was erected to these 5 soldiers, 3 of which are somewhere near that cenotaph. The other 2 are long lost to history somewhere in Prospect Hill. These are veterans of the Battle of Gettysburg who died of their wounds at Washington Hall, the Oddfellows Hall off of South George Street in York. So we don't, again, know exactly where they're buried, but these are the only marker to the dead Confederates from the Battle of Gettysburg who are buried here in York. There are also, by the way, 32 veterans of the Battle of Gettysburg from the Union Army who died in York that were interred in Prospect Hill Cemetery. Now, just to show how things have changed over the years, this marker sits out of the way near the fire hall in Dover Borough. But if you stop at the fire hall and look on the back of this, it commemorates the Dover's role in the Gettysburg campaign, not honoring the Confederates that came through, but again, marking and remembering the fact that Dover was among the towns that Jeb Stuart's 4,500 cavalrymen rode through, in fact, camped at 3 separate locations in and around Dover. So this would have been the largest concentration of Confederate cavalrymen to camp in York County. The infantry, of course, was elsewhere a few days earlier. But again, this marker's there. Feel free to visit and take a look. Again, you can see it's at the Dover Fire Hall. That's on Canal Road, East Canal Road, just across the street, catty-cornered from the Rudder Station. Jim mentioned at Accomack, there had been a dead Confederate cavalryman whose body washed up, possibly from the skirmish at York Haven, possibly a deserter, possibly a scout who was trying to get across the rain-swollen river and drowned, or succumbed to his wounds if he was one of the Confederates who was wounded at York Haven, which is what I still suspect this man may have been. Over the years, it was marked by an oil drum. A number of other markers were put up. Hurricane Agnes in 1972 actually washed away the gravesite. But over the years, other markers have been destroyed by Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee. Destroyed it, but there still remains a marker. So this is the other dead Confederate, if you will, that's here in York County. Jim, back to you.
Yeah, just pause briefly. Any questions at this point? Anything you want to talk about?
I have a quick question, and then there's a longer question from Tom Davidson. Just briefly, I've never heard of the 21st Century Confederate Legion before. I'm guessing it's like Sons of Confederate Veterans kind of group. Have you ever heard of it before, aside of that marker that's at Prospect Hill?
No, I've actually not encountered them. I don't know if that was a local group or what. And I've actually, even though I just bought a mausoleum plot in Prospect Hill myself, not far from this site, but I've never actually asked Jack or any of the people there the story behind the marker, who put it in or what. I'll have to do it the next time I'm there.
Yeah. I'm curious, from our side at the History Center, we often encounter things that are done by different memorial groups and lineage societies, I should say. So, okay, the question from Tom Davidson. He said, I consider the dusty turnpikes, Jim's comment, as much a part of the Underground Railroad in York County as these prominent locations. Do you have any stories about freedom seekers traveling along the road? People had to travel either by walking, wagon, train, or boat. Also, the east-west private turnpikes from York became part of the Lincoln Highway, I think, as we know, dedicated as a national memorial to President Abraham Lincoln in 1913. So I think his primary question is about
The roads.
the dusty turnpikes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you read The Ground Swallow Them Up or Guiding Lights, Underground Railroad Conductors of York County, I discuss a lot of the stories that took place along these roads and actually have maps of the Underground Railroad routes through York County, which include US Route 30, of course, the Lincoln Highway. They include Route 116, Route 74, just a number of different routes in York County that were involved in the Underground Railroad, as well as some more obscure roads as well. So I'd invite you, Tom, to take a look at those two books. And if you have any questions, feel free. I'll be happy to meet you again for lunch and or get together and chit chat as we've did late last year. So
I remember,
continue.
Scott, you
Right.
writing that they actually at one point they just walked across the, the covered bridge that we're seeing
Mhm.
here. They just walked across the bridge. So they were
Right.
using the turnpike. Surprising that they could just do that, but they, at least in one case, that documented case, they did.
Yeah, in fact, there was a stop on Route 30 that was the old York Valley Inn, of course. That was a major route to take freedom seekers from York directly east to the bridge at Wrightsdale. Was right across what today is the Lincoln Highway.
Why don't we just go ahead and move on? We'll have one more stop at the end. Go back, Scott, to the piers. One more. Yeah, I'll do this real quick. This is something I don't know the other way. I only became aware of this in the last 3 years, and so maybe this is new to someone. If you go to Columbia Crossing and go to their parking lot, in the upper part of the parking lot, there's a road that goes to the north. I think it's a gravel road. It takes you back into a meadow, and in that meadow, you'll see these piers, and these are the bridge piers that support the bridge there to the upper right. This was the cover bridge that burned. Those piers supported, were built in the 1830s, and they supported the bridge that burned 1863, a second bridge that was built in 1868 and came down because of wind in 1896, and then an iron bridge that was the last bridge across there. So those piers did a lot of work in their lifetime. I think they were strengthened. Scott Mingus has noted that they were strengthened for the iron railroad bridge that came down in 1964. Anyway, you can go into that meadow and see the piers. You can crawl in the piers, and it is kind of interesting, that quiet area there. It is really quiet. People go fishing there and so on. You can see the way it's portrayed. That area is portrayed as just a very busy area in this slide at upper right. Go on to the next one. Going. Okay, well, I covered it. You get the idea. Go ahead, Scott.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know if you were going to do this one, Jim. Sorry. There are other sites with meaning. The site of the quarry near Debtor's Mill. Jim has talked about the picket near Debtor's Mill and the Mifflin House. So we talked briefly about the death of a quarry. There was I'll go ahead and take this, Jim, if you don't mind. There was a black man that was stealing horses, if you will, accompanied the Confederate column of Major James Nounan, presumably who had come into York County from the Northwest from that area and moved into as far south as Dover with a patrol of some 100 or so Confederate cavalrymen. They went down what was then known as the State Road, Harmony Grove Road today, and took on this map from 1860, they took horses from almost every single property. 90% of the property owners on this map filed damage claims, again, that you can read online at the York County History Center's website. 6 of these men, 3 of them members of the Spar family, who lost 13 horses collectively among the three men, as well as Lewis Reaver, John Reeser, and a store owner by the name of William R. Smith. They went out looking for this guy. When they heard reports that this African-American man was still in the neighborhood, they found him near a quarry, again, off of Harmony Grove Road, and they shot him and covered his body up alongside the road and went back to their houses, satisfied they'd taken revenge. Well, three men from Wellsville, led by one of the Wells family himself, John E. Wells, insisted that these men be brought to trial. They were brought to trial in August of 1863, and the charges were dismissed. They had not found him guilty at all, and all six men ended up living the rest of their lives. In fact, Jeremiah Spar went back to the Army in the 87th Pennsylvania. He was a veteran that was on furlough at the time that he was physically the man who pulled the trigger. Jim, you want to add anything?
Yeah. I'll just add, I was out there. This is the value of actually going out and tramping. And I talked to Glenn Julius, who is 100 years old, and he he was aware of quarries there, including one in the little village of Mulberry, where he grew up. These are brownstone quarries out there. And Jerry Jones said there's a series of brownstone quarries in the Conewago Hills from Roller's Church all the way up to Debtor's Mill. Debtor's Mill is where the Bermudian Creek comes together with the Big Conewago. And it's really where Warrington Township comes together with Washington Township and Dover Township, out in that same area. But he wasn't aware of a specific quarry in the Debtor's Mill area. So this is an area that we haven't yet found, that quarry or a quarry in that Debtor's Mill area. We have to keep looking for that. I would just say also that this is, you can characterize this as nothing other than a lynching, where you have six guys going after a single black man who wasn't proven to be a horse thief. He was suspected of being a horse thief. And so they took justice into their own hands. Go on to the next one. We're still in Washington Township. And if you've never been to Washington Township, it doesn't have a stoplight. There's no traffic lights in Washington Township in Western York County. Beautiful place. And, there's this, at this Debtor Mills area, it's often called the Pickets or the Picket. And the local legend that Glenn Julius told me was that there was someone that kind of characterized that. She wrote a column for a newspaper, or she somehow had access to a bigger audience. And she promoted the fact that George Pickett was there. And, Glenn Julius said 100 gets pretty exasperated. He said George Pickett was never there. He never got this far east. It was named after an undertaker. The picket fence that you see upper left, this is from Glenn Julius. That's on Pickett Road. He's a woodworker, undertaker. His place, as you look at this picture at the right, is back in those trees in the background. That was where his place stood. But the Pickett Road, the whole Pickett idea at Debtor's Mills really comes from the fact that the prominent man with a picket fence. Yeah, I just wanted to point. Yeah, I can point this out real quick. There is the Mifflin House. Here is it would be developed. There's a plan to develop. It hasn't been announced, or it's not official. Although these renderings look pretty official to me. To make the Mifflin House an Underground Railroad site into a visitor center, a welcome center. And one of the features about this, because we're on the topic of tramping, wanted just to point out, if you look at, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but the plan is to have visitors to the welcome center to walk, down this trail here as enslaved people might have done, who were seeking their freedom. They might have gone from the Mifflin House, which I believe, Scott, I'm losing track of it, but I think it's right here. Then they walked. You can walk. You'll be able to walk all the way down to the river. And this is public land down here, so there'll be a park down there. So we'll do some real tramping there once this whole complex is developed. Scott?
Yeah, no, Jim, this is still you on the Gordon's Revisit. Go ahead and do that.
Yeah, I didn't know if you had anything else to add about the Mifflin.
No, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, this is we've talked about John B. Gordon several times here tonight, and he came back 31 years later and visited York, and he was on a tour of the United States, including in York was on a stop, and you can see from the clipping off to the right, he was received with enthusiasm. Here's a man that invaded York County, stole 1,000 horses, or was part of that initiative. It killed a hero in Wrightsdale, and really disrupted York County in a way that is still felt today. And he comes back to kind of an enthusiastic welcome in 1894. And where he went to the York Opera House, and that's where he spoke. That was built in 1881, designed by John Dempwolf, one of the Dempwolf brothers. And it remained in place until 1936, when it was demolished. It was a place for Houdini was there. It was a major venue here. People bigger than John Gordon, and William Penn High School had graduation exercises there. After it was torn down, the York Telephone Company on South Beaver Street was built, and the designer of that was Fred Dempwolf, John Dempwolf's son, a member of the firm. So it's just very interesting circular thing that Dempwolf designed this. Gordon came in, hero's welcome. It was demolished, and then it was rebuilt with this very architecturally significant building off to the left.
Okay, there are certainly a lot of other sites in York County, one of which that I still personally have been exploring are the Civil War rifle pits. There are certainly rifle pits and entrenchments still left in York County. There are a number along the Northern Central Railway's former grounds, now the York Rail Trail. The one in the bottom here is some grounds that Paul Iles and I and a few other folks tramped a number of years ago near Reynolds Mill area. So again, there are Civil War rifle pits still here. We don't have any forts or anything like that, unlike Cumberland County, which still has parts of Fort Couch. But we have rifle pits and things that were built to protect the railroads. With that, Jim and I conclude. We've given you a kind of a whirlwind, scattered tour of many sites in York County. Central message, of course, being that here in York County, there are a lot of places that still have significant history. It also leads to believe that there's plenty of other places that you guys out there who are watching us can go find or go tramp. We'd love to see a number of other Civil War and Underground Railroad sites identified. As Jim mentioned, I worked hand in hand with the Civil War Trails program down in Virginia to start marking a lot of York County sites. In fact, Jim doesn't know this yet, but one of the next targets is Glen Rock, to put some markers up in Glen Rock. That'll be coming hopefully this year, as well as more markers at Wrightsville and a few other places that will talk about their Civil War legacy, as well as Underground Railroad legacy. With that, we'll turn it back to Adam in case there's any final questions or any commentary from anyone.
We did have some questions that came in previously. This question is from Eric. What other towns, I think there are loads of these from what I remember from your book, Scott, but what other towns did the Confederates visit besides York, Hanover, and Dover?
Yeah, the Confederates obviously went to Wrightsville because there was the engagement there. But if you picture that they went through almost every town in Western York County of any substance, so Franklintown, Wellsville, Rossville, Dillsburg, Thomasville, farther south, York, New Salem, Jefferson, just, a litany of different towns in that area. Of course, all the towns that went east from York, what was then Fryestown, Hallam, those kind of places. And so, you've got a lot of areas. As Jim mentioned, they didn't get to southeastern York County, and they didn't get to extreme northeastern York County, but just about every other village in the western part or along that Route 30 corridor, they certainly hit.
And it doesn't mean that those areas that they didn't invade didn't pay a price. I mean, there's 6,000, one estimate is Charles Gladfelder estimates 6,000 York Countyans served. Dennis Brand has a database of at least 600 who died. So, and some of those were from these areas, Delta, Stewartstown, areas like that the Confederates didn't raid, but there's still a price to be paid.
This question's from Scott Rosenau. He said the Goodridge Center has evidence of a hiding place in the basement. Have you ever run across anything, hiding places for freedom seekers?
Yeah, there are actually other places that I've been to, some of which are private, or the owners don't want to disclose where they're at. But yes, I have seen other sites. I will say I've been in the Mifflin House, and there are some very interesting things in the Mifflin House that 2 generations of the Mifflin family were heavily involved in the Underground Railroad, and there's certainly some very interesting places in that facility. There are hidden rooms, for example, in the Brillinger's house, now known as Elmwood Mansion, which we've never been able to prove. That was part of the Underground Railroad, but that's been York County tradition for more than 150 years that house was heavily involved. And there are a number of other places that have places as well. Keep in mind that a lot of cases people were hiding in barns, and a lot of these barns are gone. But there are still some barns in York County, again, that have hidden rooms underneath their banking, if you will, leading up to them, or hidden sections and things like that. So yeah, they're out there.
This question is from Kevin Schroyer. I'm not familiar with this, but have you heard about a sculptor named Gary Castile, who's finishing up a sculpture of William Goodrich, which would be placed in front of his home on Philadelphia Street?
Yeah, there was an effort, an initiative a couple of years ago to raise money for a Goodrich sculpture, and I haven't heard anything about it for a couple of years, and maybe that's been going on quietly. There's a fundraising campaign, and maybe they raised the fund, and that very well could be true. It just hasn't been. I haven't heard of anything final on that since the pandemic, really.
Gary's a personal friend of mine. For those who don't know Gary, he's the author of a number of different Civil War monuments around the country, including the James Longstreet equestrian statue that was installed in Pitzer's Woods off of West Confederate Avenue in Gettysburg a number of years ago. Gary has a studio in downtown Gettysburg.
Kevin mentions that the statue is almost finished.
Oh,
So,
Yeah, that's my
no, but
understanding that hopefully it's almost done.
okay. Yeah, I have not heard of anything in the library, so but that will be definitely something to remember. Just checking over. Oh, let me switch over to Facebook, and I should have said this earlier, but we do have a few questions, a few comments. But I do not see any questions on Facebook, just a few positive comments, which is good. But if anyone has a question, this is a great time.
They just would unmute, right? And Adam, just
If anybody wants to ask, not sure that the attendees have the permission to unmute,
Yeah,
but
put it in the
I would
chat.
get the message.
Okay.
Yeah, we have this set up as a webinar as opposed to a conference. So. But let's see. Many thank yous to both of you who have come in on the chat, just to let you know. People are thrilled. So
Yeah, we wanted to
greatly
do something a
appreciate
little
your
bit
time.
different because so often people talk about their history, but as we started with and we're going to leave people with is get out there and explore. Almost every part of York County has not only Underground Railroad and Civil War history, but all kinds of history. Every unique community has its own story, many of which are reflected, of course, in the York County History Center's current exhibits and future exhibits. So, get out there and tramp with permission.
Yeah, and I wanted to just plug those Hanover placards, wayside markers that Scott talked about. They're on witnessingyork.com. All of them are, so you can see them digitally. And so thanks for having us here tonight.
Just one more question from Mike Staub, and then I think we'll let go for the evening. Are there any GAR meeting locations that still remain in York County?
Good question. I think the majority of them are long gone. I'd have to think through if there's actually any that are still left in existence. There may have been some temporary buildings, but the majority of them are pretty well gone. Most of these buildings were short-term or were used for other purposes that the GAR happened to use. So I'm not aware of any that are marked or any that come off the top of my head. Mike, obviously I'll research that. I'll shoot you a private message if I find any.
Yeah, if you have other questions and so forth, put them in the chat on History Center or Retro York. This is shared Retro York, and we'll answer them. And as you come across in your tramping, as you come across things, share it on Retro York, share it on the Civil War Roundtable Facebook. Get out word. Obviously, it's very interesting to a lot of people.
All right. Well, I think that will do it for us then this evening. I want to thank both of you, Scott and Jim, so much. I've seen a few of these presentations you've done, but nothing with this much detail on all these different sites. And I think people were, and again, tying the Civil War and the Underground Railroad together and showing how the roads and paths influenced these events is very helpful to people. Just before we sign off, don't forget, in 4 weeks' time, on March 16th, we'll be having our next roundtable on the subject of women in the Civil War, and I invite you all to join us. And don't forget about all those other events on our webpage. We have a lot going on in the next few weeks. Thanks again, gentlemen, and thanks to everybody who attended tonight, and we'll see you shortly.